Hey guys, I'm Saurav, and in this video I will be talking about camera settings. In my previous videos I have talked about camera settings such as aperture, shutter speed, ISO, how to use manual mode, but I found that beginners find it difficult to understand which settings should they adjust first. When I was a beginner, even I used to face this issue. That's why I came up with this idea. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to consider 5 different scenarios, 5 different locations in different lighting conditions and tell you how I adjust my settings. So I won't only use my manual mode but also the semi-manual modes like aperture priority, shutter priority, and tell you when can you use those modes as well. Before watching this video, you need to be clear about the basics. So if you don't know what aperture, shutter speed, ISO are, I would highly recommend you to watch those videos first and then continue watching this video. If you're already familiar with the basics, continue watching this video. Without wasting any time, let's get started. So right now I want to capture her portrait, and while capturing portrait I want a good depth of field. The lens I'm using right now is the 85mm 1.4 and I'm going to shoot the images wide open at 1.4 again to get that depth of field. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my aperture to 1.4. That's going to be my first priority. The shutter speed and ISO I will handle it later. So now you might be confused, what do you have to set first, your ISO or your shutter speed? Right now I am at shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. So anything about 100th of a second is fine. If I use a very slow shutter speed, I might introduce certain shakiness in the image. If I use a very fast shutter speed, the problem is the image won't be shaky, but I have to increase my ISO a lot and that will result in grainy images. So I have to make sure I maintain a decent shutter speed so that I can shoot at a lower ISO. Now I have a plenty of sunlight, the sun is just about to set, so I know about ISO 100 or 200 will be fine. If you see this particular image, the model is perfectly exposed but the highlights are blown out. And in photography there is no such correct exposure. Now if I want the details in the highlights, what I'm going to do is I'll point my camera towards the highlights and I'll get a good reading of highlights. So just about 1/320th of a second. And then I will focus on the subject and there I have it. So the model might be slightly underexposed, but now the thing is the highlights are not blown out, and that is why I can overexpose the shadows. I can get the shadow details in post-processing. But remember, if you clip the highlight details, you can't get back them in post-processing. So always expose for the highlights if they're important to you. And this is how you deal with portraits or any type of situations where you want more depth of field. So right now I'm shooting a bunch of kids who are playing, and while they are playing, they're continuously moving. So in order to freeze them, I have to set a faster shutter speed. So I'm going to use 1/4000th of a second and I'm going to use shutter priority. So shutter priority will give me flexibility over my shutter speed. But the thing is, I also want flexibility over my aperture. So what I'm going to do is then I'm going to go to manual mode. In case you don't want to mess up with your aperture, go with shutter priority. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to use 1/4000th of a second, but I'm going to use my aperture of 2.8 because I want that depth of field. My ISO is set to 100 and it is actually a bit underexposed right now because of the faster shutter speed. So I'm going to use my meter reading and increase the ISO till the meter reading is at 0. So it gives me the meter reading at ISO 400. I'm going to use continuous autofocus but single point autofocus, and I'm going to track the subject as it is moving. I'm going to shoot in continuous mode. So as the subject is continuously moving, I'm tracking the subject is in focus, and I know because of that wide aperture I have got good depth of field, but at the same time the subject is frozen because of the faster shutter speed. This is how you capture moments when you have subjects moving faster and you want to freeze them. Talking about low light photography, there are 2 issues you face in low light. One, the images are very dark. Second, the images are very noisy. Let's solve one issue at a time. Talking about dark images, it's not the problem with low light. You are actually using wrong settings. Low light photography is not different from daylight photography. The settings, the basics are the same. First, stop worrying about the ISO. Let's talk about the aperture and shutter speed. Now, depending on the subject, I set my aperture. If it's a portrait, I use a wider aperture. If it's a landscape, I tend to use a smaller aperture. Then I focus on the shutter speed, and shutter speed is the thing you have to worry about. When shooting in low light, I try to maintain a shutter speed that's as low as possible. What I do is, suppose I'm shooting with an 85mm lens, I start with 1/85th of a second or something closer to that. I do not use a faster shutter speed, because if you're using a faster shutter speed, you have to increase your ISO because you're decreasing the amount of light coming in. So depending on the subject, I set my aperture and I use a lower shutter speed. Then I start worrying about my ISO. If you're using a crop sensor body, above ISO 800 will give you much more noise, whereas if you're using a full frame body, up to ISO 1600 is manageable. And don't worry about grainy images. If you have to increase your ISO for a decent exposure, do it. Shooting a darker exposure, overexposing it in post-processing will not give you a good result. Rather, get the optimum exposure in camera and that will give you the best result. I hope you understood how to shoot in low light. So now I want to capture this particular landscape. Now when you're capturing landscape, you want the foreground and background both in focus. Unlike when in portrait photography, you want only the subject to be in focus, but not the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a smaller aperture. I will start from f8. So now there are two options. Either you shoot in manual mode or you shoot in aperture priority. Now I'm going to shoot in aperture priority, and the two settings I'm going to use is aperture f8 and ISO 100. Talking about shutter speed, the shutter speed will be decided by the camera. So let's take one image. So now I will check the histogram. Talking about histogram will give me the details about whether I have clipped any shadows, whether I have clipped any highlights. Now if you see this particular image, I have not clipped anything. The shadows, the highlight details are proper, but every time you won't get such perfect situations. There will be situations where your camera will maybe overexpose or underexpose the image. That time you have to use the exposure compensation. So if I feel the image is too bright, I will just use -1 of exposure compensation, and there it is, it's one stop darker. Similarly, if you have a photo which is one stop darker and you want to brighten it up, you can take an image with EV +1. So that's how exposure compensation works. That was one approach. Other approach is in manual mode. So in manual mode, the first thing I'll do is I'll set my aperture to f8 or f10 depending on the situation. So aperture f11 will give me a sharper image than f8. I can also shoot at f14, f16, but beyond a certain range, beyond f11, f13, the lens starts producing softer results. So you have to find a sweet spot. So I'm going to be at f11. Right now I'm shooting in manual mode. My ISO is set to 100 because as you can see it's daylight, so I don't need to boost my ISO. Then I'll set my shutter speed. So what I'll do is I'll point my camera towards the highlights. Yes, and once I have a proper reading of the camera, proper meter reading, and then take the image. And that's how you capture landscapes or any scene where you want a great depth of field, where you want the foreground, the midground, the background all to be in focus. Talking about camera settings, it's not that difficult thing. If you're a beginner, you might be overwhelmed in the beginning, but it's just a matter of practice for a few weeks and then you'll be good to go. Just keep in mind the basics, focus on the composition, and initially do not try using manual mode. Try aperture priority or shutter priority. Make sure your exposure is correct. Always check your histogram to get details about your exposure in much more detail, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, press the like button. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Bye.